Hello and welcome to Clumsy Crafting. I am your host, Bray Wright. Now today I'm going to be teaching you some intermediate to advanced crocheting techniques. Specifically, I've picked 3 stitches to show you, not because these stitches are like the most popular or the ones you'll encounter the most in patterns, but because they have techniques that you will likely encounter in intermediate and advanced crocheting patterns. And seeing someone do these stitches or doing them yourself will help you understand these techniques and what benefit they bring to the pattern. Now I've got a couple rows of half double crochet already done here just so that I'm not starting straight from a chain. You might start straight from a chain, but I just decided to have a couple rows ready to go. Once again, I've got my nice size 4 worsted weight yarn and my size H/size 8/5mm crochet hook. These are just the standard size yarn and crochet hook you will probably be using in most patterns. This particular piece has 13 stitches because one of our later rows will require a specific number, and 13 is one of the numbers that falls into that range. I will also state that for some reason the math just was not working on this pattern. And that happens sometimes despite our best efforts. Either we miss stitches or we miscount or just something happens and the math just doesn't work. If you do have that happen, just do what I do and throw an extra stitch in the middle or at the ends. Most people won't notice. Now the first stitch I'm going to teach you in this video is called a puff stitch. And it's called this because it creates, well, a little puff. Now at the start of every row in this video, you're going to chain 3 and turn. You're also generally going to go into the first stitch of the row. I know in last video we said you're going to skip that one, but the math is kind of weird on these stitches for a variety of reasons, so just go into the first stitch. So you're going to yarn over, go in and pull up a loop, similar to how you would do with a half double crochet. But while you would normally just pull through at this point with a half double crochet, for a puff stitch, you're going to yarn over again, go through, pull up a loop, and then do that as many times as needed until you have the number of loops you want. We're going to go with 7 loops. So then you're going to yarn over and pull through. And then you will have a little puff of yarn, hence why it's called a puff stitch. Now, again, if you're doing stitches with weird math, you're going to want to count to make sure you're going to have enough room and space. That's why you can see me counting repeatedly. Like I said, sometimes the math is just weird. Now in a puff stitch, you're generally going to chain 1 and skip the next stitch. So you're going to go into the next stitch over. And you're just going to do what you did for the first stitch. So yarn over and keep pulling up loops until you have 7. And once you've got 7, you yarn over and you pull through all 7. And sometimes it can be a little hard to pull through all 7 at the same time. So don't be afraid to take it slow if you need it. And just remember, every time you finish a stitch, you chain 1 and you skip the next stitch. That's how you do a puff stitch. Now here's a couple things I do want to note while I'm going through the puff stitch here really quick. First of all, my start and ends to all of the rows might be a little weird in this video. And that's because generally when you're doing stitches like this, you would have a specific pattern that would tell you exactly how to start and end every single row. I don't have that. I was kind of doing it half off of memory, half off of what I did look up. So some of my start and endings are a little bit odd and a little bit funky, and that might have contributed to my issue with the funny math. Generally, when you encounter these stitches in a pattern, they will tell you specifically how to start and end every single row. Another thing to note is that I'm not teaching this because you're going to encounter a ton of puff stitches while you're crocheting, but I'm teaching you this because pulling through multiple loops at the same time is a technique you probably will come across. It might not be 7, but I have come across many patterns where I've had to pull through multiple loops all at the same time. And the more practice you get with it, the better and the faster you get with it. Now I'm just finishing up my last puff stitch here, and then we can take a look at it and see what it looks like. Now, as you can see, there are clearly those little puffs where you did the puff stitches, and the little gaps where you did those chain ones. Now, when you're doing your second row, you can do the puff stitch into the gap, or you can do it into the stitch. That's up to you. Doing it into the gap will be much easier, and you'll probably prefer it. Now, like every single time we finish a row in crochet, we're going to count our stitches to make sure that we have the same amount that we want. And then we're going to make our chain stitches and turn. Again, you're just going to make 3 stitches for this next row. Now in this next row, we're going to be doing a V stitch. And this means we'll be doing 2 stitches that form a V shape within the work. Now, like I said earlier, normally patterns will tell you which specific stitch to go into. I'm not going off of a specific pattern, so for this part at least, you're going to go into the first stitch. And we're going to be doing a double crochet. So you're going to yarn over, go into the stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop, and then pull through 2 loops at a time. Then you're going to chain 1. You're going to do another double crochet in the same stitch that you just went into. So both stitches will be in the same stitch. And these 2 double crochets joined by the chain stitch in between will end up creating the V of our V stitch. Now you're going to skip the next 2 stitches in the row. And you're going to double crochet into the 3rd stitch away from where you're working. And again, you're just going to keep doing that double crochet, chain, double crochet in the same stitch. And then after you do a V stitch, you're going to skip 2 and move on to your next stitch. Now again, my reason for teaching you this isn't because you're going to come across a V stitch in every single pattern, but because there are techniques similar to this that you might come across. For instance, you might come across patterns that ask you to do multiple stitches in the same stitch. Or you might come across stitches that tell you to do a chain in between stitches to give you that spacing. And that's just something I feel like you should probably know if you're going to be crocheting. Another thing to note, and this is also the same with the puff stitch, is that if a pattern asks you to do chains in stitches or in between stitches, generally you're going to be putting your next row in the spacing of the chain ones. Which generally just makes crocheting a little bit easier because you just need to get into the space. You don't need to get into that tiny little stitch. You don't always have to do it in the space if you don't want to, but it is so much easier, so consider it. Now, if we look at our V-stitch, you can kind of see why it's called a V-stitch because it does have those little V's formed by the double crochet and the chains in between. And again, you're probably not going to encounter this stitch on most patterns, but you will encounter stitches similar to it. So it's generally a good idea to kind of understand how the technique works and what it does to the fabric. Now I'm going to show you the final stitch of today's video, and that is called a shell stitch. Now this stitch is actually pretty common in crocheting patterns, and the technique it uses is also pretty common. So you're getting kind of a 2-for-1 in this one. And again, you're just gonna chain those 3 chains, and we're going to start in the first stitch of the row because that's just how the math worked out in this entire video. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna put a single crochet stitch into the first stitch of the row. Then you are going to skip 2 stitches and put 5 double crochets into 1 stitch. Don't chain 1, I don't know why I did that. But skip the next 2 stitches. And then you're going to yarn over, go in, and double crochet 5 times into this 1 stitch. And you're probably sitting there thinking, Bray, are you insane? There's no way I can fit 5 stitches into 1 stitch. Yes, actually, you can. And that's part of the reason I'm teaching you this technique, is because you will have to sometimes fit multiple stitches into one stitch, and it will look like it doesn't fit, but it does actually fit, which is very interesting. Anyway, once you finish up your 5 double crochets, you'll notice that your stitch is forming a little half circle. And that's why it's called a shell stitch, because it looks like little shells. See, it's got that half circle and it's got the little hole at the bottom that looks a little bit like the bottom part of a shell. Now what you're going to do is you're going to skip another 2 stitches and you're going to single crochet into the 3rd stitch away. Now because of all this very specific skipping, this stitch does require a specific amount of chains in order to make it work, which is why we have the 13 stitches. Because in order to make this specific shell stitch, you need a multiple of 6 plus 1. So 12 is a multiple of 6, and then plus 1 is 13. So again, you're just going to put those 5 double crochets into the 1 stitch. Now your second row of shells is going to be a little bit interesting because you need to start with a half shell, which means you're going to chain 3 and then do 2 double crochets into your first single crochet stitch. And this will create a half shell to start your row. Then you're going to do a single crochet into the tallest double crochet of your shells. This will anchor your half shell. Then you're going to put 5 double crochets into your single crochet again. Do you see where this is going? Now your shells go into your single crochets, and your single crochets go into the high point of your shells to create more shells. Now it might be kind of hard to tell the different rows apart in my shell stitch because I'm using the same yarn for both rows. A lot of patterns will have you changing yarn or changing color, but you will still be able to tell that there are clear half circles for my shells. Now when you get to the end of your row of shells, you're just going to put 3 double crochets into that last stitch, which should be a single crochet. And this is to create another half shell that will end out your row and make it look nice and even on the sides. And there we are. I'm just going to quickly count out my stitches, and then I will show you the half moon effect of putting those 5 double crochets into the single stitches. And it does, again, kind of look like shells. And that's what putting multiple stitches into one stitch does. It creates like a half moon, half circle effect. And again, that's just a really good thing to know when working on a project. So let's go over what we learned today. Today you learned how to do a puff stitch, you learned how to do a V stitch, and you learned how to do a shell stitch. But more specifically, you learned how to pull through multiple loops on your hook, what doing a chain in the middle of a stitch will look like, and what putting multiple stitches into one stitch will look like, which are all very important things to know while crocheting. Anyway, I had a lovely time crafting with you today, and I hope you had a great time crafting with me. This is Clumsy Crafting. I am your host, Bray Wright, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!